Now for the fourth of four relationships that I want to go through, Umbreon and Espeon. I'll be honest, I think there is a lot less going on here than with the previous three relationships, because these characters do show up later in the game, have less time to develop, etc. But it's not really fair to call these two filler characters at all. Umbreon in particular adds a very interesting perspective to the team, as I will elaborate on later. So our first introduction to the pair technically comes during the Swadloon mission. An unknown Pokemon was spotted near Post Town and labeled as suspicious. At the same time, Swadloon has gone missing, and Lillipup and Leavanny think that he's in Flora Forest. You go there, and there's a scene where Swadloon has an encounter with presumably that same Pokemon. However, once the party reaches Swadloon, he doesn't look like he's in trouble at all. What's going on here? Not long after, the one who ends up being the real suspicion-labeled Pokemon ends up making it to Post Town, then collapses and is taken in by Swanna. The party goes to Swanna's Inn and finds out that this is Umbreon. And to clarify, how I say the real suspicion-labeled one is because it doesn't make sense until your second playthrough, but Umbreon was the one that was spotted and ends up collapsing in town. However, the one that was interacting with Swadloon, of course, is Espeon. I just thought I should throw that in. But the party goes to Swan's Inn and finds out that it is Umbreon that collapsed. Girder is giving Umbreon a hard time because, of course he is, but Rizion rather, recognizes Umbreon as an ally from their previous encounter before the game takes place, and points out that Umbreon is a dungeon researcher. Umbreon needs some rest, so the party leaves. The next day, Umbreon says he needs to leave Post Town right away, but he's pretty clearly still exhausted. He explains to the party that he and his partner Espeon were chased down and the two eventually separated. Umbreon believes that it's because the two were in possession of enter cards. He then gets excited at the opportunity to bring this up and starts explaining the technical details of the enter cards, and then everyone in the room falls asleep in the middle of this monologue, which is a great moment. You know, I can't say that I was particularly interested in this explanation myself, and I guess the game acknowledged that. Umbreon's a little disappointed, but it seems like this result was pretty much just what he expected. There must not be too many others around that share Umbreon's strong interest in truly understanding mystery dungeons, as well as the enter cards, the ley lines, and the magna gates, and etc. So Umbreon decides to just show off a magna gate in action. He points out that this gate doesn't actually do anything since Espeon's cards are missing, hence he needs to go find her. Virizion brings up the point that the party going to find her is probably a better idea than Umbreon going to find her alone while weakened. Umbreon reacts in shock, as if he legitimately didn't consider the possibility of being helped by others in this way. He promises to make it up to the party. This shocked reaction makes sense if you consider two things about Umbreon that we're going to keep in mind. One, he's really, really hyper-fixated on his work, and two, he keeps a closed circle. It's easy to imagine that Umbreon was on a little bit of a one-track mind ever since he separated from Espeon. One goal, this is my best way of achieving it, let's do it now and get it done. And that best way doesn't need to involve anyone else. We, of course, later learn why Umbreon acts this way, and it's a little different from Keldio's reason previously mentioned, because right now, I know it sounds similar, but that's coming up in a bit. The party saves Espeon, and she reunites with Umbreon in the town. Umbreon describes that the two have studied the Great Glacier for most of their career, and Umbreon is especially interested in going so that he can see the mysterious Great Crystal, which he believes is inside. He rambles on for a good bit and reaches a point where he assumes Espeon had her enter card stolen and gets a little disappointed. Espeon cuts him off and acts a bit annoyed that he jumped to conclusions so quickly, which leads to the assumption from myself that Umbreon probably does this a lot. Again, really good at deductive reasoning, really stubborn and determined, but a little one-track minded sometimes. Espeon continues to point out that she gave the enter cards to Swadloon, a decision that she regrets since it definitely could have put him in danger. There's a flashback that plays in which Espeon is able to stay mostly calm in a super high-stress situation, talking with Swadloon, in order to convince him to protect the enter cards. This scenario, to me, I think the point is mostly to show that Espeon is very emotionally intelligent. Flashback ends. Espeon continues to say that she didn't quite grasp the dangers she put Swadloon in at the time, and she felt tremendously guilty. And then she just breaks down and starts crying, which at least to me was very unexpected. It shows this super empathetic side of her, even if the potential is there to be deceitful, right? Like, as was showcased literally during the flashback, that she knows how to control herself, has a grasp on I guess a lot of like psychological concepts, so she can be deceitful, but she definitely has strong empathy, I guess, to act good, if that makes sense. And one interpretation of this scene that I guess I can't really strongly disagree with, but I do somewhat disagree with, and I'm going to get into that, is Espeon made a big deal out of Swadloon being safe in order to save face more than actually showing empathy, since this scene does take place right in the middle of town and all. But I don't know, to me that just seems like a little bit of a cynical interpretation for how I saw her character. Yes, Espeon is focused primarily on her work, much like Umbreon is, but this kind of empathetic behavior, to me, was pretty consistent with how she acts throughout the rest of the game. I mean, as far as I see it, her arc basically starts and ends in this one scene. Aside from a part near the end of the game, which is going to be mentioned later, which to me is a bit of a shame because I think they could have explored some interesting scenarios with Espeon in having this character that I guess was like openly deceitful, but I guess the writers found it more interesting to make her the yin to Umbreon's yang, and in that way add another layer to his development coming up later. So the next day, the party meets up with Umbreon and Espeon, who asks to join the party. Espeon cites that their reasons for joining are not only to repay Espeon's rescue, but also because they are seeking help from the party and traversing the Great Glacier. Espeon butters up the player and partner by acknowledging, oh, maybe the party has their own priorities, but like she's already well aware that they have an obsession with the Great Glacier from yesterday. Like, she knows this, she's pretending that she doesn't, and she's, pretending they're not going to accept this, right? And right after they say yes, of course, Umbreon apologizes and notes that he and Espeon will actually not be able to help on the team's missions right away because, drumroll please, we need to focus on our research. Now, I don't want to give the wrong impression and imply that Umbreon and Espeon have like a sinister motive or whatever, but it's pretty clear that at this point they're valuing their goals related to the Great Glacier above the party as a whole, or at least to me, it seems that way. It seemed clear, that is. The party's being treated like temporary allies rather than friends, probably because that's exactly what they see it as. The party gets something out of it, they get something out of it, everyone's happy. And people that have been paying attention might be saying, hey, isn't that what Virizion was saying? And yes, yes, exactly. And I feel like that's definitely on purpose, because this game does that a lot, actually, with having these very like similar viewpoints that are bringing characters together outside of their primary relationships. I think it's really interesting, and it's also interesting to me that this stance is what Umbreon and Espeon default to, right? Speaking of Virizion, she is standing right next to Umbreon and Espeon during this very scene. And again, she is a character who not only has a history with defaulting to temporary ally over friend, but also literally has encountered Umbreon and Espeon before. But of course they didn't end up sticking together long term, because Virizion says that she just kind of wandered around everywhere before making it to Post Town. Now, is this because, this being the fact that they didn't stick together, just because Virizion didn't truly want to trust anybody, and that's it? Or is it also because Umbreon and Espeon somewhat feel the same with anyone outside of their partnership? I mean, we know Virizion felt comfortable enough around the two when they first met to ask to go with them to the Great Glacier. Maybe it's a little bit of both. While Umbreon and Espeon definitely haven't descended into nihilism in the way that I described as being the case for Virizion adopting a lack of trust, I believe that this is the case because Umbreon and Espeon both trust at least one other person in the world, and that is each other. In that sense, they aren't completely isolated, and in addition, they've been keeping busy for a long time with all the research related to the Great Glacier. Don't underestimate what something like that can do to help you keep your sanity. And this idea of alliance over friends is reinforced when the party goes to tell Umbreon and Espeon that Virizion is not going on the trip. Umbreon has none of it. It makes it clear that Virizion in particular has to go along. To me, the only way this reaction makes sense is if he cares more about Virizion due to their previous encounter, whether it's due to him trusting her more or just having more of a personal connection compared to the rest of the party that he's just met. After all, we know that the party members have their own good reasons to want to go to the Great Glacier, and Umbreon knows this as well. He just doesn't really care as much in this case. But once on the trip, Umbreon again does a lot of geeking out over some of the various discoveries at the glacier, and he seems more cheery than usual, which makes sense, since this is supposed to be the payoff for all of his and Espeon's hard work. The party collapses at the top of the Glacier Palace. Umbreon is quite upset in not being able to see the Great Crystal itself, but eventually settles on just making it this far once Kyurem tells everyone to scram. While heading back, the party reflects on the joy they got out of their trip, including Umbreon for once. This is a character who has always been polite and nice, but not necessarily warm to the party. He's usually excluded from these kind of, I guess, team bonding conversations, but now he's joining in. Perhaps seeing Espeon repeatedly show confidence in the party gave Umbreon his own confidence in them. It seems that the trip has been a bonding experience for everyone, and Umbreon feels a little bit more open as a result. This is supported by Umbreon's reaction during the scene where the player and partner leave from Mount Kilionea. Umbreon says that he believes that the player used to be a human, because they, along with the partner and Virizion, who both defended that claim, are his friends. This is the first time in the game that he uses that word to describe the party, calls them friends. And he is confident in that assessment as well. So now we go forward to after Kyurem kills Hydreigon in the desert, and you wake back up near town, aka the scene when I realized why Umbreon and Espeon are even in your party. Here's the Umbreon quote, and it's a longer one. Quote, When you think about what the partner heard from Kiram, it's because of the selfishness of all the Pokemon that the world is growing cold, right? Even Hydreigon said that it was Pokemon's negativity that created the bitter cold, so it's probably true. And if it is true, then even if we manage to destroy the bitter cold, nothing's really going to change, is it? The way the world is now, the strife among Pokemon won't stop. The future looks bleak, and everyone's feeling the same unease about it. As long as those negative emotions keep on stifling the world. Even if we destroy the bitter cold, it will simply be created again, don't you think? I kind of understand what Kiram meant when he said that the future can't be changed, unquote. There's more conversation after this to get through, but I want to establish a couple of things here. First, and probably most obvious, is Umbreon's direct claim of a lack of faith in humanity that was suggested earlier in the game. But now it's confirmed. Second, of course, is it would be Umbreon and not anyone else in the party that would even be thinking about the bitter cold regenerating later on. We know that he is very analytical, has very strong deductive reasoning, thinks the whole plan through well in advance to try and identify any potential missteps. He's the workhorse calculated researcher on the team, right? So to him, going after the bitter cold doesn't make much sense if the end goal is to save the town and release them from the spiral of negativity if it's just going to come back again. It's like cutting the head off a Hydra, right? And many may recognize that this was brought up in Super Mystery Dungeon as well with the Dark Matter, which at that point in that game had already regenerated once. A part of me does prefer how Super handles this because they outright state in that game what is just implied to be a part of Umbreon's thought process during this scene in Gates, which is negativity can't be permanently removed. It's impossible because it's fundamentally a part of the living experience. You biologically can't always be at 100% happiness in your brain. Umbreon proposes that the innate negativity in the town means that they will continually amplifying the existing, let's call them minimum, negative feelings in their mind, and a new bitter cold will continually be created and destroyed. To go back to much earlier in this analysis, comparing the Quagsire theory of the town only spiraling due to the bitter cold existing, and the Kiram theory of the bitter cold only existing due to the town spiraling, Umbreon is definitely of the Kiram school of thought. The conversation continues. Emolga gets upset and asks if Umbreon wants the world to end. Umbreon says, quote, "Of course not. I just said I understand how Kiram feels, because there's nothing we can do. Have you really never thought the same thing yourself? You never thought this world is messed up beyond any hope? You never thought that it'd be better to just start over from scratch? Even you must have felt that way sometimes, right?" Unquote. Espeon then agrees with Umbreon's, or rather Kiram's, thought process and hangs her head in sadness. Umbreon's long-term plan to fix the town that makes the most logical sense to him is just to burn it down and rebuild from there. Anything else will just be a series of repeated struggles for a new generation to fight the bitter cold again. And what kind of fate is that? Of course, it needs to be said that while this thought process is definitely solid and not filled with tons of logical holes like Virizian's philosophy that was previously discussed, it's only solid if you ascribe to the Kiram theory. Under the Quagsire theory, there is no second bitter cold because the town will have learned their lesson, especially now armed with the knowledge of how the bitter cold was formed in the first place. No extra suffering necessary. The fact that Espeon agrees completely with Umbreon makes their relationship make a lot more sense. The reason why they keep such a close circle and try to stay within their world of their research and continually keep themselves busy is because, well, they think the outside world sucks. This context gives the pair a unique dynamic in the broken world of Gates to Infinity, because they're not really depressed or having similar mental issues like a lot of characters. They didn't have some big traumatic moment like a lot of characters, and they're not the ones instigating negativity in others like a lot of characters. In fact, they're generally pretty kind in their interactions with others. For all intents and purposes, they're just normal, decent people. But even then, they can still have a negative outlook on the world at large, which, make no mistake, is absolutely the case with plenty of people in real life. So it stands to reason that the only way for Umbreon to crack through the Kyurem theory and rationalize a way for the Quagsire theory to make sense is by presenting a fact to support the Quagsire theory. This is what the partner does in their big speech right after this, citing the party's own journey to learn to trust each other. And then after this, Umbreon says, quote, "Never mind what the rest of the world is like, we all still believe in one another. I nearly lost sight of that. And it's not like we're all that special. There must be other Pokemon out there who still trust one another. Not every Pokemon in the world can be looking for a fight," unquote. While this is a sharp turn in opinion, it's really constructed the same way as Umbreon's previous statement, and it's worth pointing out that Umbreon previously said that he wanted to believe that defeating the Bitter Cold would be meaningful. He just didn't see how it was conceivable. Someone that wasn't already open to change would certainly have been harder to convince, but a little bit of positive personal experience mixed in with a supporting idea to consider was able to turn it around for Umbreon. This of course applies to Espeon as well, since she shared that mentality, but she's not really presented as the focal point of this particular scene, which is why Umbreon is who I keep bringing up. However, she adds an important point here, going back to her emotionally intelligent thought process. If we operate on the assumption that positivity is spread on the individual level, then the party's efforts will almost certainly pay off eventually, since it becomes continually easier to convince even the deeply nihilistic to gain faith. The chain reaction of positivity works in the same way as the chain reaction of negativity. She, of course, turns out to be exactly right, judging by Dunsparce's results from interacting with the town. Art complete for Umbreon and Espeon. So that's all 4 relationships in Gates to Infinity discussed, in my opinion, in pretty deep detail. But to close this video out, there's still one thing that isn't completely answered, even after finishing the game. Obviously, the party succeeds in defeating the Bitter Cold, but do they really change the future? The town certainly seems more positive in the immediate short term after seeing the Rainbows of Hope again. The main enforcers of the Bitter Cold, Kyurem and Moonit's gang, turned away from wanting the world destroyed. But there are some things near the very end of the game and during the epilogue that explicitly don't make sense, and even Hydreigon notes this. Once the player fulfills their duty in the Pokemon world, they are supposed to create a distortion in the Pokemon world. Then, once they're put in the Ball of Light to be sent back towards the human world, everyone is supposed to lose their memories of the player, removing that distortion. Of course, the memory forgetting part doesn't happen. Then, once both the partner and player agree to wish for the player's return at the Hill of Universal Order, the collapse of the hill, and thus the distortion, completely stops. Hydreigon is basically an omnipresent being, and even he is not sure how this is possible. His hypothesis is that the laws of nature must have somehow changed from the town's resolve. But it's no more than that, a hypothesis. But what if the answer is much simpler than that? What if there's no distortion because the player actually didn't fulfill their duty and the Bitter Cold is going to return like Umbreon thought? It's a distinct possibility, but we don't really know for sure. The game never takes an irrefutable stance either way as to whether the Quagsire theory or the Kyurem theory is correct. The player is largely left up to their own interpretation. However, one stance the game does definitely take is that which theory is correct doesn't matter. While defeating the bitter cold was definitely a struggle, the world became a much better place immediately following its departure. The partner notes that this is the first time in their life that they ever felt the world was at peace. And that's a beautiful thing, and it's worth fighting for, even if that battle needs to be repeatedly fought time and time again throughout the generations. This is that central message of Gates to Infinity, the quite unignorable theme that has stuck with me so hard and has slowly been impacting my own decision making. Faith in ourselves, faith in one another, and faith in the world will keep allowing us to continually overcome our struggles.